Now we're going to move into introducing our speakers for the evening. First, we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Professor Jeffrey Wolf, and after that from Rabbi Farber. And after that, we will have an opportunity to hopefully have some time for questions. You're welcome to write in questions over the chat during the evening. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead with these presentations. So Rabbi Professor Jeffrey Wolf is an associate professor in the Talmud department at Bar Ilan University in Israel, where he specializes in the history of halacha, among other things. He studied for 9.5 years under the Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal in Boston and in New York, and he received smicha from the Rav in 1982 at RIETS. He learned for 4 years in the YU Kollel and for 2 years attended Kollel Eretz Chemda in Jerusalem. He also received smicha from Rabbi Gedalia Felder Zatzal, the late Av Beit Din of Toronto. He received his MA and PhD in medieval Jewish history and literature from Harvard University under the guidance of Professor Izdar Torsky. He was the executive chairman of YU's Orthodox Caucus, and in that capacity was a moving force behind the RCA prenuptial agreement. In Israel, he created YU's Orthodox Forum, helped to found Beit Hillel, and served on its board for its first 5 years. He also sits on the board of Ma'aleh, NGO Monitor, and the Museum of Italian Jewish Art in Jerusalem. Rabbi Professor Wolf will be discussing the conversion controversy, roots, and implications. So, Rabbi Wolf, thank you so much for joining us to give us historical context and perspective on the conversion issues in Israel today. I also want to thank you for taking the time before this evening to sit and talk with us, the Matan team, and help us think through the concept of these mitchabrim events.
I'd like to add just apropos of that before we get started on the topic, and that is that as somebody who's been here a little bit longer, we've been here 30 years, there are the challenge of being an Anglo, especially an Anglo-Ole in Israel, is dual. On the one hand, it's really important for us to feel part of the the world behind us, the world in which we decided to live. On the other hand, as I've stayed here longer, the truth of the matter is I realize just how desperate, they don't know it yet, but how desperately Israeli society needs the insight and the experience of those of us who come from English-speaking countries. So it actually is a two-way street. And I think mitchabrim is a wonderful expression of the proper way to achieve that sort of.
Okay, so thank you for reminding us of our important contribution as Olim here in Israel. Okay, so now to our topic. Debates about conversion go back to at least Hillel and Shammai in the Talmud. There are several stories about non-Jews approaching Hillel and Shammai to convert, where Shammai takes a more strict stance and refuses to convert them, while Hillel agrees and teaches them Torah. In addition, the Talmud contains comments about the importance of welcoming converts on the one hand, and at the same time includes statements that strongly discourage converts. So with this background in mind, as a historian and a rabbi, you combine an understanding of long-term Jewish views on conversion with practical experience today. Can you please give us some historical perspective on how conversion worked in the future?
Okay, let me, all right. Because our time is limited, I gave an entire year course on this last year, 2 years ago. No, it was BC, before Corona. So let's do this as focused as possible. Number one, our point of departure really is actually quite a lot later than the Talmud. First of all, you have to keep in mind that as far as halacha is concerned, the point of departure is the ratification of the ratified constitution of the of Judaism. So therefore, really, we're talking about whatever's in the Talmud only is of relevance as refracted through the words of the Gaonim, Rishonim, Achronim, and so on. But the truth of the matter is that the issue of conversion is actually, it's a new issue. It really starts in 1789, because until 1789, which is the usual, all right, we back on. Okay, start again. The issue of the challenge, conversion as the challenge in the sense that we discuss it, really starts in the it's a modern issue. because until the 1780, let's use 1789, the French Revolution rather, as sort of a symbol of emancipation. Conversion, when it was allowed, usually it was illegal under Islam, and under Christianity, it was a capital crime for a non-Jew to convert to Judaism. It was a capital crime for a forced convert to convert to Judaism, or for a convert to revert back to Judaism. So it was, as a phenomenon, it did happen, and it did happen not infrequently, but it was not all that common. Up until the French Revolution, and in Arab countries later, conversion, the question of conversion was always a question of motivations. Why do you want to convert? And that's the kind of question that the rabbis ask in the Talmud, in which things are that's basically emphasized in halacha. The reason is very simple: not because there wasn't an assumption, or there wasn't a required commitment to living life as what we would call today an Orthodox or a Shomer Mitzvot Jew, because that was the only Judaism that existed. Karaite Judaism is not part of the equation here, so that therefore there's checking out the subsequent behavior of the convert was irrelevant, because it was a given that a person was going to be observant, because the only place to be a Jew was in an observant Jewish community. There is a sort of an unstated, there's a principle in legal literature that which goes without saying usually does. And that's the reason that you don't find in the Shulchan Aruch any specific statement that the ger has to, in the mikveh, say, I promise to accept all of the mitzvot, this, and this, because it was a given. What the Talmud says, and which is repeated almost word for word by Maimonides, and certainly word for word by the Shulchan Aruch, is that we check the person's motivation. We make sure that they're sincere. We give them a sort of an idea of what kind of life they're going to have, and what kind of circumstances they're going to encounter. And basically, there's no conversion institute, because the convert learns like a child on the job. You mimic what other people do, and you learn from what other people do. And this is, for those of you who are familiar with another one of my teachers, Professor Chaim Soloveitchik's classic essay, Rupture and Reconstruction. It was a mimetic society. You learn how to be religious by doing what everybody else does. So hence that was all the attention that was required. This changes in 1789, because at that point the process begins by which Jews over a long period of time are no longer obliged to live in Jewish communities. They end up living outside of Jewish communities. The level of observance goes down drastically in all kinds of places, especially in Central and Western Europe. And it's not no longer given that every Jew is living an observant lifestyle. At the same time, the fundamental sort of emotional or ethnic loyalties, or religious loyalties, even in a certain sense, of people who fall in love with non-Jews is still there. So they want their spouses to be part of the Jewish people. The taboo against intermarriage only really begins to collapse in the second half, or like the last third of the 20th century. I remember as a kid when I was growing up in the 50s, and I'm very old. In the 60s and 70s, the percentages of intermarriage, for example, in the United States was 17%. I mean, it was still a shanda to intermarriage and marry. And now we're talking about in the United States between 70 and 90%, depending on where in the States we're talking. So that there was this desire to convert, but then the question became, so what do you require? And that opened up the discussion of, well, we have, on the one hand, we want the person to convert. On the other hand, this person may or may not be observant, and it's a given that the person, first of all, when they come out of the mikveh, will be obligated to do mitzvot. And that raises a moral issue. In other words, say you decide to convert somebody, and the person's not going to be, the person's not going to be observant. Let's leave the formal acceptance of mitzvot aside for a moment. There's a moral obligation. If we are religious individuals, We believe in God. We believe that people who are obliged to do mitzvot will be rewarded for their good deeds and will be punished for their bad deeds. If we convert someone and then they don't keep the mitzvot, we are putting them at a risk. We are putting their souls at risk by doing so. On the other hand, maybe there's a communal, there's something communally to be gained by that. That's part of the consideration. There's an interesting, sort of very passionate and very sad responsum of Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, who was one of the leaders in this issue of dealing, because he was a rabbi in Berlin, where assimilation was rampant. His responsum in which he describes the situation in which a guy wanted to marry a non-Jewish woman. He had already married her civilly, and he wanted a Jewish wedding. And Rabbi Hoffman was faced with the situation. Well, I don't want him to go to a Reform rabbi. On the other hand, she's going to become observed. She's going to be obliged to keep mitzvot, and so what are we going to do? So he has this whole long speech he gives her. Well, we have to make her swear of Ehrenwert, she says, on her honor, that she's going to do this and keep kosher. And there's something very, very unsettling about the sort of the stress that you can feel in the words of David Tzvi Hoffman, which expresses the dilemma of poskim. Through that, as far as this is concerned. Now, this new situation led to the creation of a spectrum of approaches to the question of converting people who will not be observant, and the spectrum is very wide. On the one hand, there have been those who consistently have said, as Rav Moshe Feinstein said on one occasion, he changed his mind on a number of occasions, apparently, because his responsa, which are dated and written over long periods of time, show different approaches to the issue. Said, that if somebody's going to convert and they're not going to observe the mitzvot, then the thing is it's not worth anything. Just because it doesn't say you need Kabbalat mitzvot doesn't mean you don't need Kabbalat mitzvot. As I said, that which goes without saying usually does. That's one end. The other end, in my opinion, and I say this with all due respect, in my opinion, is mistaken. There is an opinion that was brooded. It's most official. It's especially associated with the late Rishon LeZion, Reb Ben Zion Meir Tzachai Uziel, who was a rabbi in Salonika in the 1920s for I think 2 years, and he was faced with a lot of intermarriage among the Sephardim. They're really Sephardim. They're Megorashe Sfarad there, who lived in Salonika, and he zeroed in on a statement of the Magid Mishneh, major commentary on the Rambam, where he says Hodat mitzvot eina ma'akevet, that because he based on a diuk in the Rambam, he says that you can see that the truth of the matter is that yes, the ger will be chayev in mitzvahs at the afterwards, but that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be an acceptance committee, a Vadat Kabbalah, as I said, which is the major thing which preoccupied Chazal and poskim before that, and poskim afterwards rather, and therefore he said that you can actually convert people without any clear commitment to mitzvot. That position, from a literary point of view, I mean, it exists. I mean, the Maggid Mishnah says this. The question is, what does it mean? So you could interpret that line in accordance to the way that Rav Ben Zion Meir Tzachai Uziel says it, and as such, it's a credible. It's a legitimate halachic position as such. However, I think it's based on a misunderstanding of what the Maggid Mishnah was saying. In the early 19th century, the Reb Yaakov Loiberboim, who's known as the Nesivos HaMishpat, one of the great early Achronim, wrote a letter to a colleague, which is and was included in the colleague's collection of tshuvot called the Chemdat Shlomo. And the Chemdat Shlomo he says as follows: he says there is a fundamental difference between Kabbalat HaMitzvot and Hoda'at HaMitzvot. He says the Rambam never occurred to the Rambam there could be possibly any kind of conversion without commitment to mitzvot. What the Rambam was talking about was the formal abjuration of the ger in the mikvor before the bezdin, that he or she accepts the mitzvot. But if it can be shown that the person has absolutely no intention to keep mitzvot at all and doesn't accept their obligation, then it would be of no value. That was the understanding. That was accepted enthusiastically, I must say, by Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal. In my own ears, I heard him say it twice. And Rabbi Yossi Adler, for those of you who know from Teaneck, has confirmed that. But the story doesn't end there, because the question then becomes, what is the nature of that Kabbalat HaMitzvot? Does that mean all mitzvot? Does that mean that you have to put on sheitel if you're a woman? What exactly does that mean? There again, you have a relatively broad spectrum of what the minima are. I will quote two examples from people who are beyond question the towering figures of halacha, two towering figures of halacha in the 20th century. I will start with the later one because the earlier one is more important for our purposes. The later one is Reb Moshe. Reb Moshe Zatzal says on a number of occasions that Kabbalat HaMitzvot doesn't necessarily mean accepting every single last little seif in Shulchan Aruch. It means that the ger commits themselves to a life of mitzvot based on what they know that Jews do. Or in another case, he calls it Rov Dinei Torah, whatever that means, the majority of laws in the Torah. In other words, there is a certain amount of give as to what the convert is obliged to do. Certainly, it doesn't include what I not long ago. I think is Rabbi Melchior here. I think we were both at this meeting a while ago about this, and a mutual colleague of ours said that one of the gerim was asked a question straight out of the Minchas Chinuch, and the ger apparently wasn't able to convert because they didn't know the answer to the question of the Minchas Chinuch, which, by the way, the Minchas Chinuch does not give an answer to, but that's another story. Anyways,
so we hear that there's really a wide range.
Cannot believe it, but anyways, for those of us who were taught that the answers of the Minchas Chinuch are not good, but the questions are good, then you have to ask yourself, well, we Jewish too. Anyways. More important for that purposes, and this is really the crux of what the discussion in Israel is about today. Although there's so much screaming and yelling that who would know. I don't know how to put. I can't underline his authority sufficiently. The towering, the most important Ashkenazi halachic authority in Europe in the generation before. In the years leading up to the Second World War, was by all accounts, except perhaps in Hungary, and I don't want to insult any Hungarians, was Reb Chaim Ezer Grodzinski. Reb Chaim Ezer was the Rav of Vilna, but his authority literally was unchallenged in the Orthodox world. Reb Chaim Ezer, in the third section of his Tshuvot Achiezer, quotes this distinction of the Nesivos about Haudat HaMitzvot and Kabbalat HaMitzvot, and he said Kabbalat HaMitzvot is not necessarily identical with Shmirat HaMitzvot, and he says explicitly that it could very well be that a person will be Mekabel HaMitzvot without a commitment to Shmirat Shabbat, if they do so l'te'avon, if they do it because of convenience or whatever the case might be. What does that mean? What that means is, he says, Kabbalat HaMitzvot means I accept my obligations. I understand from this moment on, so the ger would say that I am bound by the mitzvot. I recognize their authority on me, and therefore I am willing and ready to acknowledge the fact that I would not be a good Jew if I were not to keep them, and I would be punished. In other words, you're accepting the system, and that has to have some exception, it has some expression, but you're accepting the system, but not necessarily Shmirat HaMitzvot. That's a very, very important distinction. It was the distinction upon which most of the Giyurim, for example, like Rabbi Druckmann, which were a big news item a number of years ago, were carried out. So that's where you have. So as you can see, there's a very broad, nuanced series of arguments around this around this issue, and they ultimately could devolve around this question of to what degree does the by all accounts, obligation of the convert to observe mitzvot afterwards. How does it play out in terms of the relationship between that and the conversion? There's another issue that comes up, which I don't want, which is not for now, and that is the question of can conversions be annulled ex post facto? I'll just leave that there. I will call your attention, however, to a wonderful volume that was put up by the Orthodox. That's why I like to broadcast from here, because at least at my library here. But put up by the Orthodox Forum series, Conversion into Marriage and Jewish Identity. There actually is an article by Rav Rimon on this on the issue of the possible nullification of conversion. Let me just add one more point from a historical point of view. There is a fund there for the generally speaking, and I put this out I mentioned this in my in an article I recently published, of all places, in the Jewish Press rather. Jewish Week was not a program. No. For me to go and say I'm in favor of Matan Kahana's plan in the Jewish Week is like playing to the crowd, and I would get Yasher Koch from people I don't want Yasher Koch from. If you want to hack this out, you got to fight it out on your home turf, and for that purpose, the Jewish Press was the place. In any event, that's why I've been publishing in Beersheva, which I'd never done before. There is a fundamental difference, and this is something which nobody has. I think I was the first person to mention this. There's a fundamental difference between the process of conversion abroad and the process and conversion in Israel. In the diaspora, the luxury of withdrawing behind into our communities and keeping non-Jews or bad or invalid conversions, things like that at arm's length, it was adoption. In addition, because of the dynamic in the diaspora, especially today, in which the postmodern world is basically corroding the world in which Orthodox Jews live, there's even more reason to reinforce sort of the demands. Our situation here in Israel is different. It's different for a number of reasons. Reason number one is the fact that whether we like it or not, and I happen to like it personally, we are very tribal. Jews in Israel are tribal. We are, there's a famous, I think it was in Casablanca, there's a song in Casablanca, Kulanu Yehudim. And that's a sensitivity. Oh, thank you, Asha, that's right. In Casablanca, there's Kulanu Yehudim, in which there's this sort of sense that we're all in this together. And yeah, we fight and we argue and we scream and we yell and we're not nice. But at the end of the day, I mean, unfortunately, it's usually during bad times, we're in there together. And we will do anything for each other. And all of us who have had the unfortunate experience of living through wars knows exactly to what I'm referring. Now, part of that solidarity is the fact that everybody can marry everybody else. Number two, that the fact that everyone is a Jewish and has the same accepted baseline who's Jewish allows also for the creation of a spectrum. Retzif, we talk about the Datziyei HaRetzif, that Jews, kids that were raised religious, they're a little bit more, they're a little bit less, but that's good because you can go back and you can go forth, and you can have the same family where somebody is like this and somebody is like that, and there's motion because the framework remains the same, in the sense that the fundamental definition is identical. However, how one expresses one's Judaism, there's a lot more stretch to it. A lot more give to it, rather. But that is not just a convenience, and is not just one of the pleasanter parts of living in Israel. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most critical parts of our ability to be able to withstand the pressures, external and internal, that we have in this country. And that if that is impugned, if schism comes to the Jewish people in the land of Israel, that will endanger our very survival. I think I'm not kidding. It is, as far as I'm concerned, from a historical point of view, it is a matter of pikuach nefesh, nothing less. It is not possible under any circumstances to remove a person's status as a Jew, which creates a lot of anomalies. It creates an anomaly that Ben Gurion's grandchildren from his son Amos are not Jewish. And Muammar Gaddafi was Jewish. So yeah, you have odd situations, but it is a fact that you can't take away a person's Judaism, as Rashi once said, as Rashi used the Gemara, all right, in the original way, Yisrael pal pisha chatzah Yisrael. The only, and Jews have never divided on a permanent basis based on any issue of religious observance, not kashrut, not Shabbat, not Yom Kippur, not Taharat HaMishpacha, nothing, not tefillah, nothing. Only one thing leads to a fatal split, and that is the question of who is a Jew. One of my friend and colleague, Professor Larry Schiffman from NYU, in a little book he once wrote called Who Was a Jew, put it very nicely. He said, we know, last night they broadcast Agadot HaChurban, and we know that in Beit Sheni there were at least three major, what should we call them, streams? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the and denominations. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and then they have to figure out what to do with the Kanaim and the Sikari. Okay, they fought like the Dickens. Anybody who's ever studied Beit Sheni knows that the kinds of wars that went on, and sometimes it led to bloodshed even. However, nobody ever questioned the other one's bona fides as Jews, and there were converts that were going on, conversions that were going on. Apparently, and he proves this point from a number of different major sources, they agreed on the base definition of who was a Jew, and so that that is a consideration which must be front and center for us. And I would add one other thing, and it's much to my chagrin. The chief rabbis of the state of Israel, together with some prominent rabbanim who are city rabbis, have consistently said over the past 3 months that we have to batten down the hatches because Israel is becoming less and less Jewish. So I don't know what country they live in, but for the past 25 years, I've been watching, and this has been confirmed by every single academic study, from the IDI, which is not exactly the most Orthodox friendly institution in the world, to the new book by Shmuel Rosner, and which I loved, Shmuel Rosner and what was his name, Camille Fuchs, called Yahadut Yisraelit. And if you're not Hebrew isn't up to it, you can read it in English. Israeli Judaism. That this country for the past 25 years has become more profoundly Jewish, more profoundly engaged with tradition, more profoundly learning Torah, more profoundly going to shul across the boards, so that the all-encompassing envelope of Judaism, which is increasing here, actually bodes well for the intensification of the Judaism of people who come from the outside, and not the other way. Okay, I hope that I've sort of
this is excellent.
quickly covered all the
bases. Quickly, but we even lost some of our time, unfortunately, to very unpleasant things in the beginning. So thank you so much for your patience and your flowing along with all of the challenges. And I want to let everyone know that Rabbi Professor Wolf is going to stay with us till after Rabbi Farber's presentation. I hope that's okay, Rabbi Wolf.
Wouldn't miss it. I'm here. I'm here. I've got my Pepsi Max on my cup, and I'm fine.
Excellent. He's with us, and we are going to have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Especially if you have questions, feel free to send them in over the chat. And I also want to mention a special thank you to Yaakov Shasha and for saving our Zoom event here. So thank you. Okay, so now we are going to shift gears. Thank you so much for presenting the historical perspective and starting to think about, well, what did conversion look like before the state of Israel, and what are the different perspectives in halacha and how conversion works? And now we're going to fast forward to our current situation, and since the foundation of the state of Israel, and we are going to hear from Rabbi Seth Farber. Rabbi Farber is the founder and director of Vitim. Many of you know him, but we still will introduce him as the founder and director of Vitim, an organization committed to making Israel's religious establishment respectful of and responsive to the diverse Jewish needs of the Jewish people. And Rabbi Farber is the founder and director of Gior Kahalacha, which I know Rabbi Wolf is also a part of, Israel's largest non-governmental conversion court network. He is a recipient of the Nefesh B'Nefesh Bonei Tzion Prize and the Israel Ministry of Aliyah and Integrations Prize for outstanding contribution to Israeli society. Rabbi Farber is also the rabbi of Kilat Netivot here in Ra'anana, a very special community, and we are very grateful for him taking the time to join us from his very busy schedule and because he's a little under the weather. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So, Rabbi Farber, you have been hugely involved in questions of who is a Jew in Israel today, and especially helping Jews around the world navigate the process of proving their Jewishness, either for the purpose of making Aliyah or to marry in Israel. You've also been a leader in helping converts navigate Gior in Israel, and you have seen up close both the beauty of this process and the faults. Before we get into the controversies, I want to ask you to give us some background. But before I do, I also want to let our audience know that one of our purposes this evening is to really fully understand the full picture. And while we're not bringing a dissenting view here tonight, I am going to ask Rabbi Farber in a moment to give the different perspective, give the other perspective, so that we can fully understand what the controversy, what the conflict is about. But before we do that, could you please give us some background on how the conversion process works in Israel and what are the proposed changes?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, and really yasher koach to Matan and to all both particularly the participants, but also the organizers for this series and for this evening. And thank you for inviting me. I want to try to be as concise as possible. So let me talk about 4 moments in terms of the history of what's gotten us to this point. The first one is actually a Turkish moment, because there is no conversion law in Israel right now. What they're debating right now is a conversion law, but there is no law. And the law that relates to conversions actually doesn't relate to conversions to Judaism at all. It relates to changing one's religious status in Israel. That law is not Israeli. It was adopted by the Israelis from the Brits, who got it from the Turks. It's more than 100 years old. And that's how things work in this country. And the way the law works for coming to Judaism is the same way it goes if you're a Muslim and you want to become Christian, which is that something called the Rosh Eidah Hadatit, that is the head of the religious community, makes a declaration based on his, and it's always in this case his, determination that you have, changed teams. And the Rosh Eidah Hadatit under the Chok HaMaradat files a certain set of paperwork, and that in effect means you're converted. What that really opens the door to is a question of, and before I get to the next set of 3 points that I want to make, the 3 dates that I want to talk about, the Chok HaMaradat really asks the question, what does it mean to convert? Because to convert in a nation state isn't the same thing as converting in a shtetl or converting in New York or converting anywhere, basically, because we have a whole new dimension to what it means to convert in Israel. You're now registered. Now, it might have meant something in Europe over the course of time, but the numbers were simply not there. So conversion has 3 what I would call concentric circles of recognition. One is within the consensus of the body politic. Does the community recognize you as, for our sake, Jewish? A second thing for modern state of Israel is, does the state of Israel recognize you as Jewish for civil purposes? And that can divide into 2. One is the opportunity to make Aliyah. As you all know, there's a law of return in this country that allows people who converted, at least overseas, to be able to make Aliyah. There's also, not in your Tudat Zehut, they don't list Jewishness in your Tudat Zehut, but there is something called the population registry, the Minhal Uchlusin, and they do register people who are Jewish, and that has very, very thin a layer of legal implications. And that's a second layer or circle, if you will, of recognition. And then there's a third layer of recognition, which is marriage. Now, the Chok HaMaradat obviously can't talk to the consensus, because the consensus is something that's sociological in nature. It can talk to the question of, can you be registered as a Jew? And it did. And it also relates to the fact, at least until now, of how you get married, because there's a marriage law in Israel that gives marriage the full authority over marriage, in the case of Jews, to the rabbinate. The first question we need to ask ourselves when it comes to the Chok HaMaradat is, who is the head of the Jewish community? Who is the religious head? When it comes to the head of the Muslim community, it's very obvious it's the chief Qadi, and when it comes to the Christian community, so There's actually 9 different heads, but that's not important right now. But when it comes to Judaism, it's not clear. And in fact, over the course of time, things changed. During the 70s and 80s, municipal rabbis took that responsibility upon themselves, at least to a large extent. And they were performing conversions, and they were being recognized for the Chok HaMarat Dat. They were able to issue, in some form or another, Tu'udot HaMarat Dat. It's not really a conversion certificate. It's a civil document that allows you to change your status in the population registry, or then on the Tu'udat Zehut, or get married. Excuse me. Beginning in the 90s, the chief rabbinate took that over in the late 90s. And by 2000, that had already changed. It was only in the province of the chief rabbinate. And that brings us to the second date. So the first thing that I'm trying to articulate is the way the status quo. The status quo is the way people convert to Judaism is under this Chok HaMarat Dat, which is the same way anybody changes any team. And it is controlled only by the way it's turned out, and subsequently by the way some of the courts have ruled, by the chief rabbinate. The second important milestone is the Aliyah Hagdolah. We lived through miraculous times. You can't argue anything else. And if you thought 48 or 67 were impressive, so think about the fact that 1,100,000 people who in 1970s who were screaming, "Let my people go," and 1, 2, 3, 4, open up the iron door, they all managed to make Aliyah between, or many of them, or 1,100,000 that managed to make Aliyah between 1988 and 2004. The Aliyah Hagdolah brought a surprise, really something people hadn't thought about before, or really hadn't given a lot of consideration to, which was that at least some percentage, probably 30% or so, came in Aliyah under the law of return based on the fact that one of their grandparents was Jewish and not necessarily their mom. So either their dad or their mom or their parents on the side of the father. And because of that, all of a sudden the state of Israel had to contend with a new reality. That number, which 20 years ago when I began ETIM, was at around 250,000 people who were registered in the population registry as chasrei dat, meaning lacking religion, but made Aliyah as Jews. They have a dual identity. Those people, that number has now gone up to 450,000. So that's a second important date. Excuse me. The third important date is a set of dates that relates to private conversions, and particularly the reform movement getting involved in conversion. Tonight, I'd like to avoid the issue of people converting overseas as much as possible and only talk about conversion in Israel. But over the period from 1988, when the first reform convert got recognized in a decision in the Supreme Court called the Shas decision, ironically, that enabled people from overseas to get to make Aliyah and to be recognized as Jews when they converted reform. Over the course of time, in a number of Supreme Court decisions, the most important one being in 2002, when the Supreme Court recognized that people who converted in the reform and conservative movements here in Israel, meaning outside of the rabbinate, could be recognized by the population registry as Jewish. So they could be registered. And that took a further step in a court case that went from 2005 till 2019, with an important stop in 2017, when the Supreme Court recognized the capacity of reform movements, conversions in Israel also to be recognized for purposes of Aliyah. That is two civil purposes that are significant, What this did was put the rabbinate up against the wall. The rabbinate they wanted to maintain hegemony over conversion, and they certainly didn't want the reform movement to have the right to convert. So 3 moments yet so far to get us to this point. 1, just to summarize, the Chok HaMarat Dat, the law of changing teams, if you will. 2, the Aliyah Hagdolah, the huge emigration of immigrants in the former Soviet Union, the first time a mass immigration of non-halachic Jews who came on Aliyah as Jews. And 3, the achievements of the reform movement, which were very small number-wise, but very significant from an ideational perspective, that put the rabbinate against the wall. Now, in 2000, the Israeli rabbinate recognized, and the prime minister, Sharon, who was connected to the former Soviet community of the former Soviet Union, recognized that there was a challenge on his hands. And once the centralized chief rabbinate had taken over conversion, he realized that we weren't going to allow city rabbis to perform conversions the way they did until then. Excuse me. He recognized that Sharon in particular recognized that they needed a solution for massive numbers of immigrants in the former Soviet Union who were looking towards conversion as an option to at least enable them to get married and also to change their status in the Ministry of Interior. Remember, these people made Aliyah as Jews. They had blue Tu'udot Zehut. They were full members of Israeli society, but they were being prevented, again, that they weren't registered as Jews. Very, very small implications. We don't have to go into that now. And they weren't able to get married here. Prime Minister Sharon then in 2000 created a conversion authority. And titularly, he appointed Rabbi Druckman as the head of it. And that conversion authority began performing conversions in two different ways. One, civilly, and secondly, through the IDF. And the IDF has this wonderful conversion program. They convert about 700 soldiers a year through the program. The idea was to enable more moderate rabbis that served on the rabbinical courts that were under the supervision of the chief rabbis, allow them to perform conversions as well. So that was a critical moment. That brings us pretty much till today, meaning that conversion authority in different iterations basically has been in extant for 20 years. The number of conversions in the conversion authority has gone from about 1,000 or 1,200 to its height about 7,800 a year, including the army, and has now gone back down to about 1,500 a year over the course of the last 20 years. It's been run out of the prime minister's office almost from the beginning. And most importantly, the way people go through conversion in Israel, its budget is about 63 million shekel a year. And the way the conversion authority works is basically they have one dimension that was created through something called the Naaman Committee in the year 2000 that is the study component of conversion, and a second dimension, which is the rabbinical court. The study dimension is based upon, at least in principle, a Jewish united movement of all the streams of Judaism, including the Reform movement. The Beit Din itself is 3 rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, who, and this is the critical point, are appointed without any of the bureaucracy that appoints rabbinical court judges or regular judges, but they were simply handpicked by the chief rabbi without any, oversight. Mm-hmm. That brings us to the last 10 years and the fighting that's now reached its crescendo in the last few days. Over the course of time, as the numbers went down and as the response wasn't commensurate with the need, at least according to some people, one of the fingers got pointed at particularly the rabbinical court judges. Now, to be sure, many of the rabbinical court judges who are not the rabbinical court judges of the Beit Din Rabbani, they're special conversion court judges. Many of them are religious Zionists, and many of them are good people, but they're all appointed by the chief rabbi. And that means there's one halachic methodology that is applied. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the idea was if we could somehow take away that particular dimension of the monopoly, meaning the judges would have more pluralistic approaches within the Orthodox community, that might allow for more people to convert. Over the course of the last 11 years, there's been a number of efforts to have the pool of rabbis expanded. The most recent one, which is going on right now, is Matan Kahana's effort, which was included in the coalition agreements in some form or another, which is to enable municipal rabbis also to perform conversions. How exactly that plays out, we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but that's basically where things stand today.
So, while I give you a second to have a drink. So if we had to kind of pause here for a moment and pinpoint what one of the biggest challenges, we're seeing that basically the changes that are proposed really want to a certain degree, take the control out of the chief rabbi's hands, solely out of the chief rabbi's hands and this particular rabbinic court, and potentially open up the options of other rabbinic courts to do conversions, such as Giur Kahalacha, which you're involved in, which I know you're going to get to, and so if that's the case, let's take a moment and try and advocate for the other side. What would be the reason to resist these changes? Let's go there for a moment.
Okay, so let me make clear that I don't think that you have to differentiate between the rhetoric and the substance. There's a lot of rhetoric, and Professor Wolf referred to this before, that's disgusting. It's nothing less than that. It's pure hatred for the other side, and it goes in both directions, and it's unfortunate, and it's unnecessary, and it shouldn't be there in the first place. I'm trying to remove the rhetoric. Look, the debate today, whether to expand the number of rabbis performing conversions or not, has two dimensions to it. One is a halachic dimension, and one is what I would call a logistical or technical dimension. Let me first deal with the halachic dimension. There is an approach that was first advocated by the Or Sameach or most famously, or advocated by the Or Sameach, that says that in the modern period, excuse me, conversions cannot be affected, even though the Rambam passes that conversions can be affected even, at least b'diavad, by 3 Hedyot, 3 average male Jews, that today, for all sorts of reasons, you need dayanim, and maybe even dayanim mumchim. You need judges who have a proficiency as judges. Now, what does that mean? It's not exactly clear what makes someone a judge. In Israel, there's a title judge where you take a certain amount of exams, etc. But that position has been adapted by both Rabbi Lau the father and Rabbi Lau the son. And in that sense, the conversion authority was set up in a way that even though most of the rabbis are not certified dayanim, of the 32 rabbis that are there today, I think 26 of them are not certified dayanim, but 6 of them are certified dayanim, and they always sit at the head of the court. So there's actually a halachic debate. This isn't talked about very much, but Rabbi David Lau, who's the chief rabbi today, who's in charge of this, he's actually written a number of tshuvot where he says, I believe that the Or Sameach position is the correct position. And because of this, the idea of allowing municipal rabbis who are not certified as dayanim to be dayanim is objectionable to him. This is I don't want to try to take apart the argument, but this is a very, very minority position. I don't think anybody who reads the halacha would think this is a majority position, but it is a position that's adopted. I don't think if you read the papers or you read that, you'll ever see that. But that is part of the debate. Part of the debate is, and again, removing the rhetoric, part of the debate is who gets to determine and what does Jewish life look like in a modern nation state, Jewish, democratic nation state. Is this something that has one centralized authority that determines halacha for everybody? Or is this a central authority that basically doesn't see itself as a service provider, but sees itself as a regulator, a licensor, if you will? What's happened in marriage is actually very interesting. As much as people think marriage in this country, it doesn't have a pluralistic element to it, but in fact, it really does, because the chief rabbinate farms out to the chief rabbis of the municipalities the capacity to decide how, under certain criteria, the capacity to register people for marriage. The way the Eruv is built in Jerusalem is not the same way the Eruv is built in Ra'anana, because, each of the chief rabbis is given the capacity to do that. When it comes to a very sensitive issue like Giur, the rabbinate would argue there we need to maintain our complete centralized authority. People like me, right, disagree with that approach because, first of all, we think that that's not in the interests of the kibbutz galuyot, and more importantly, it's just not working. It's not providing the kind of opportunities that orthodoxy and halakha can provide to enable people to convert.
So in your experience with Itim and Giur Halacha, and from what you've spoken of so far, we're really talking mainly about these something like 450,000 Israelis who identify as Jewish but are not considered halachically Jewish. This is for the most part the people who in theory would be seeking to convert, and it sounds like something is, there's a block, there's an obstacle here. It's not moving as it should. So could you tell us a bit more about Giur Halacha and why it is so important to provide alternative Batei Din and to broaden this this horizon?
Sure. So I think there's a bigger question of the narrative here. There's a narrative. We're living through miraculous times, really miraculous times. And the fact that so many people have made Aliyah and come here, and again, some running from and some running to, but needs to be recognized as some, and again, I don't want to sound too messianic, but I don't want to sound less messianic than I should. Right, that we're living in times that the prophet spoke about. And part of the challenge there is recognizing that not everything what comes together right away. And when you adopt that narrative, when you see that this is a special moment and a special opportunity, then you begin to think about things a little differently than maybe you did before. You say, this is an unprecedented moment in Jewish history where we need to adopt an approach that's going to enable us to have a long-term future here. when you speak about only 450,000, I think about the fact that statistically speaking, my son is a commander in, he's an officer in the Shiryon in the tanks unit. And statistically speaking, between one or two of every one of his 11 soldiers that he's in charge of are not Jewish halachically. That's a problem, right? These people were brought here and told to pay, right? They were encouraged to come here. They were told to pay taxes, right? They're told to serve in the army. And then we tell them, not only can't you get married, which is bad enough, but also you don't really belong. You're not part of this you're not really part of the story. You're not fully part of the story. So what we're anxious to do is, and we don't claim to have the full solution. What we're anxious to do is find solutions that would enable people to convert. I want to say here, and it's very important that I say this, and I've said it in every public forum that I can, even though every politician who's against me, says I don't believe it. The goal of Giur Kalacha was never to create an alternative rabbinical court. The goal of Giur Kalacha is to provide a vision for how things could be done in this country from the national perspective. My biggest accomplishment of Giur Kalacha would be to close it down, to be very clear. Okay? The fact that right now we're doing 20% of the conversions in Israel is, I think, an embarrassment to the state of Israel, not a credit to me. So let me talk about how this all developed. Over the course of the last decade or so, particularly with the halachic leadership of Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, Zichrono Livracha, we began spinning an idea of basically trying to find a way where immigrants in the former Soviet Union who wanted to convert or wanted to explore the possibility of conversion would have a much more easily accessible way to do so. I should say, and the rabbinate says this all the time, and I want to make it clear, the overwhelming majority of people today who are in this status do not want to convert. That is true. But in the most recent studies that I have, 57%, between 57 and 63%, said that were there a way like what Giur Kalacha offers, were that a way to do it, then it might be much more accessible. Rabbi Rabinovich pitched one idea, which is the real differentiating factor between what Giur Kalacha does and what the rabbinate does. As Professor Wolf mentioned before, the big discussion often surrounds the issue of Kabbalat ol mitzvot. How seriously does one have to accept commandments? How seriously does one have to adopt the commandments? How seriously does one have to perform the commandments? Theoretically, there might be a model that we could take that off the table, at least to a certain extent. And that is, there is one model. Conversion in general is modeled after the Sinai experience. But for children under bar bat mitzvah, it's generally assumed in one constellation or another, except for Rav Kook, who doesn't agree with this position, but it's generally assumed, Rav Moshe Feinstein and others, that children can convert without accepting upon themselves the mitzvot. Either it's, as long as it's, it's done through the mechanism of Zachin L'Adam Shelo B'fanav, or it's done through the Beit Din has to accept the mitzvot, or something like that. The constellations are not so important to me right now.
Because they're also not required to keep them.
Right. But children cannot do that. And because of that, right, because they're not required, exactly. So imagine a scenario where we could have parents come and say, it's very, very important for us to be fully part of the Jewish community. And we're not ready to be 100% Shomer Mitzvot. And because of that, you can't convert my wife or whatever the situation. But our children go to Jewish school, and our children have Kiddush on Friday night, and our kids, see candle lighting, and our kids go to shul on holidays. And maybe we could just convert our kids, and they'll grow up with on the horizon, the Orthodox community being on the horizon. It's certainly a possibility. And certainly in this country, that's more and more of a possibility. As Professor Wolf said, Judaism is becoming much more of a central theme in this country's life. This is a differentiating factor between what Giur Kalacha does and what the rabbinate does. The rabbinate has a rule. They will not convert a child unless the parents are married, Kedam Moshe Yisrael, unless the parents are married in the rabbinate, which precludes couples, again, I don't want to call them intermarried couples, because they're not intermarried. It happens to be the mom is not Jewish, but they're not intermarried couples, because when you come from the former Soviet Union, you might very well, the wife, and I meet thousands of these people every year, our brothers and sisters, the ones that we fought for to come here, thousands of them who very much see themselves as Jewish. They never married out. They married someone who they thought was Jewish. just turns out they're not halachically Jewish. Someone who wanted to make aliyah, but it turns out they're not halachically Jewish. So I don't want to call them intermarried couples, but couples where the mom isn't Jewish, but their house is a Jewish home. Their identity is Jewish identity. They're willing to accept upon themselves some of the mitzvot if they aren't doing it already. And we can come and convert the kids and bring the kids up in a Jewish environment. So that's one differentiating factor of Giur Kalacha. We began with that notion. Over the course of time, it's expanded to also enabling families and young couples to convert. As I mentioned, we've gotten, today we're doing 20% of the conversions in Israel. We've gotten more than 16,000 calls from people. We've converted over 1,600 families at this point, and in the last 5 years. But the main goal was not to continue doing this. The main goal was to show there's another way to do things from the way the rabbinate does it. And there is another way to do it. There's a few other ways to do it. We have one model. We're not the only model. The people who are performing conversions today, we began with, when we began Giur Kalacha, there were 6 rabbis who signed the original document. Today, we're over 70 rabbis from the Tzioni Dati community, or almost all from the Tzioni Dati community. And what we're trying to do is basically create an alternative model. And the idea is that if this law passes, then the model that we're proposing will ultimately become one of the models. And I want to make it very clear, one of the models, not the only model. We're not asking for exclusivity or monopoly or anything. We're very happy for the Rabbanut to continue doing what they're doing. And we're very happy for the Giur Kalacha model to become one of the Rabbanut's models of how to perform conversions.
So before we open up to questions to the audience, and I have to just say, when we do that, we have some limitations with our chat because of the technical issues we had in the beginning. People can raise their hands and we will ask people to speak. We'll call on you. But before we do, I just want to ask Rabbi Farber one more question, which relates to this one fine point, which I think people also just need a little more clarity on, which is that the proposed changes now, the changes being proposed in this bill by Matan Kahana. I think one of the fears, or one of the narratives that's been going out there, is that this is a sort of slippery slope. And once it's taken out of a centralized Beit Din, a centralized rabbinical court, it will, who knows? But from what I understand, in the end of the day, it still has to be approved by the rabbinate at the end. So could you speak to that for 1 minute, just to clarify?
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of rhetoric going on, right? Some of my favorite things, right? Again, I've been accused for 10 years of wanting to convert all the, and again, I have nothing against the Sudanese or the whatever, anything like that, but that's not what we're here for. In Giur Kalacha, we only convert citizens of Israel. But there's a fine balance right now that's being worked out, frankly, about the role the rabbinate is going to play. Unfortunately, until now, the rabbinate has basically just not played ball at all. They're not even willing to talk. I'll just share an irony with you. Some of you who know me for more than a decade know that 10 years ago, my organization, E-Team, sued the chief rabbinate to recognize the conversions that were being done in the IDF. And the conversions being done in the IDF were sponsored by the chief rabbinate. The local rabbis on the local scene, some of the local rabbis refused to accept their legitimacy. And after a lot of negotiations with the chief rabbinate, we decided to sue the rabbinate. Now, at the time, I actually have quotes. I don't have them here, but I have quotes, almost the identical quotes that you can hear today about this is going to destroy the Jewish character of the Jewish state. And we're going to have to make lists of who converted this way and that way. If the courts get involved, no one will ever accept these conversions. And even the European rabbinate saying we'll never accept the conversions. All those quotes happened exactly a decade ago. What happened? We went to court, we won, and eventually everybody fell into line. Meaning, and what's the great irony? The great irony is that today, the very rabbinate that said we're never going to accept those conversions stands behind those conversions and saying we're never going to accept the Giur Kalacha conversions. So there's a tremendous irony here that, again, over the course of time, I think will work itself out. I think if everybody were to climb down a little from their, the trees they've climbed up onto, it would be a little easier. Let me just give you, just before I finish, I want to just make sure that everybody understands exactly where we're up to right now. I know I live and breathe this stuff, so I know sometimes I use codes that are not simple for people to follow. The coalition agreements which were signed on the 11th of June basically put a very simple law into play. Today, meaning yesterday, I guess Sunday, a much broader version of that law was put on the cabinet, was voted on by the cabinet and passed after 3 weeks of initial discussion of that law. It's supposed to go to the Knesset. It'll probably go to the Knesset as of an hour ago. It hadn't been put on the, because of the coalition mess up that happened today. It's not going to be on the agenda tomorrow. So a first reading will happen for that bill probably next week, if the coalition lasts, and then it will go to committee. In the committee, the law is going to undergo a number of changes. Okay, I can tell you that one of the things that's going to be debated is that right now the new law says that all conversions have to be done kedin Torah, which means the chief rabbinate has absolute veto power over everything. That's going to be a point that's going to be debated over the course of the committee. I imagine those committee hearings will take place over a course of a month or so, and that'll take us till after Pesach. So you can expect this to be with us at least until May, June, when the bill will be returned to the Knesset for a second and third reading. So, and then a vote. And then once things, if that all happens, then all sorts of things have to happen. For right now, the bill talks about a steering committee that's led by members of the chief rabbinate and Rabbi Druckman and the minister, who are supposed to get together and determine how the bill will actually be implemented. So we still have a long way ahead of us. And you should just be careful. I think it's critical to recognize two things. And with this, I'll stop. One is, don't be swayed by rhetoric. Those of you who are more familiar know that I've been personally, and my organization has been violently attacked. It's not physically, thank God, but violently attacked in social media in all sorts of very, very ruinous ways and unpleasant ways. Today we were at a conference, and someone from, so to speak, the other side refused to shake Matan Kahana's hand, just to show him a slight because he feels like he's undermining the future. Don't be swayed by people's gimmicks, and that's one thing. The second thing to know is that right now the debate is an inter-Orthodox debate. The reform movement has said, we're going to stand on this side. We are not going to get involved in this debate. We understand that this is not going to enable reform conversion to be recognized in this government. And again, whatever you think about reform conversion, and it's all the positions are, everybody can have their own position, but let no one say for a moment that that's what this is about. This is a debate about within Orthodoxy. It's a debate that's based on different approaches to halacha. And in principle, if you can get rid of the rhetoric, it actually is a debate l'shem shamayim. And the stakes are very high. What we're talking about is nothing less than the future of the Jewish people, and particularly the success of this project that we call Medinat Yisrael. If we're going to be successful, we have to provide, if we're going to be successful in enabling the kibbutz galuyot to happen in a way that's meaningful to hundreds of thousands of people who are already here, then we need to find a way to expand, in my humble opinion, the way we do conversion in Israel. And I believe that there is at least one model that I think could be adopted by the Medina, by the state, that I think in the end might lead us to Chov Miftachim.
Wow. Rabbi Farber, I really want to thank you. And I want to thank you, Rabbi Professor Wolf. The work you're doing is Avodat Kodesh. And on behalf of everyone here, really, this is hopefully these sorts of conversations can be an opportunity to really move toward machloket l'shem shamayim. So thank you for presenting things so clearly and with such inspiration. And tachziku mamad, keep up the good fight. So I see Rav Eitan Ben David has raised his hand. I'm going to open up his microphone. And I also want to just once again, before we start with the questions, say a tremendous thank you to Matan and Rabbanit Koren and Rabbanit Bina and Yael Ziegler and the leadership of Matan and Tammy Levy for all of enabling this wonderful discussion to happen. So, okay, Rav Eitan.
Okay. Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Farber, Rabbi Dr. Wolf. Thank you, Rabbanit Karen, for hosting this. And okay, here my video is starting. To everybody. Thank you for presenting and sharing your ideas. I'm listening carefully and been trying to study the different viewpoints on this for the last few weeks. It's a riveting and important discussion. I guess my question for you, Rabbi Farber, is as follows. I heard a talk given by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein to Rabbanim from the Gush, and his view was as follows. He says, in principle, it's very possible that he agrees with many of the positions taken by Matan Kahana and a more lenient view of conversion. Gior Halacha, for example, the positions before by Rav Nachum Rabinovich and Rav Chaim Amsalem and Rav David Stav. But he is concerned this is going to lead an irreparable divide between the Jewish people. That you're going to have Sifrei Yuchasin, you're going to have books of lineages, and some groups are going to accept certain conversions, and others will not. And for the most part now, the system is definitely imperfect. We all agree with that. But across the board, there's near total acceptance of the Rabbanut's, conversions. And, essentially would be putting people in a situation where they're accepted by one group, not by another group. And I know that maybe in the past, certain people were converted, as you mentioned, have sort of got accepted ultimately. It really did lead to major opposition to the rabbin's conversion system. Let's say you'd have a division between the liberal parts of the Datilumi community versus the Chardal parts, and certainly the Charedim. Would that be sufficient? Would that prevent you from supporting this, this reform of Kahana? Putting the halachic issues aside about who's right and who's wrong.
So, Karen, do you want to take some more questions first, or you want me to answer?
What are you most comfortable?
Whatever's good. Okay, so I'll answer.
I think we'll forget otherwise.
Right. If you look back 10 years, you will see the word Sefrei Yuchasin already appear in the discussion about conversions in the army. The people who are most speaking about Sefrei Yuchasin are that language really comes from what's called the CER, the European Orthodox Rabbinate. And the head of the European Orthodox Rabbinate, Rabbi Ehrentraut, is not only on the record, in practice, he doesn't accept the conversions of the army, of the state of Israel. Many of you are familiar with the fact that in England, there was this child of someone who converted in the state of Israel, and they wouldn't accept him into a Jewish school, or her into a Jewish school. I don't remember. I think it was a him. They wouldn't accept him into a Jewish school. So there's always a fear that it won't be accepted. But like I said, I think this is not a halachic issue. That's just rhetoric. And I don't think it's a substantive decision. I have a lot of respect for Moshe Lichtenstein, but I find it hard to accept that he says that halachically, these conversions are okay, but from a political perspective, we can't accept them. We can't move them forward. It doesn't take into account the alternative. Excuse me. The alternative is that we're going just to have tens or hundreds of thousands of people intermarrying in this country. And that is a much more significant, in my humble opinion, factor that needs to be taken into consideration now. And if we start resolving it now, we have a much better chance of precluding it down the road, right? Most people don't face this until it happens to their family. But again, just think about the numbers, right? I look at my son, I look at the names of the people, and again, some of the soldiers who I meet, right? And I understand their status, and these guys are all, out there fighting for us. So Sharon talked about a fifth column. I talk about it from a religious perspective. From a religious perspective, if there's a halachic way to do it, if there's no halachic way to do it, so there's nothing to talk about. But if there's a halachic way to do it, don't we have an enormous responsibility to explore that halachic possibility to the nth degree? And if some people want to use rhetoric to say, we'll create Sifrei Yuchasin, so a few minority people won't marry our children. Okay, they won't. But again, if the rabbinate accepts it, so they'll be in the minority. Today, there are people who already won't marry, but that's okay.
If I may just add to that.
They don't want to marry the Moroccans either. Right?
Rabbi Wolf.
Rabbi Wolf, maybe you want to add something.
Let me add to that. I'm sorry to break in. About, I don't remember if it's BC or not, before Corona. Somehow time doesn't, anyway. I had a long conversation with somebody who has been intimately involved with Nativ, the Army conversion program from its very beginning. And we had a very long discussion about the situation on the ground. And here, with all due respect to Rav Lichtenstein, who I have a lot of respect and affection for, because we've known each other for 30 years. The situation on the ground is that many of the, and this increases as time goes on, many of the non-Jewish Jews marry Jewish Jews. They get married with chuppah kedushin, some sort of ersatz chuppah kedushin. They consider themselves Jewish. There are no emotional or what should I say, intuitional things in their way. They'll get married in Paraguay. They'll get married through Paraguay, or they'll get married in Cyprus, and then they'll have they view themselves as Jews to 100%. And as this continues, as Seth mentioned, the truth of the matter is that's equally going to be responsible for Sifrei Chasid. I mean, what are we talking about? You're talking about we're going to classify A, B, C, and D conversions. Sifrei Chasid are just going to be a question of who's Jewish and who's not Jewish, and the numbers are going to, and as the numbers increase, then the need for this kind of thing is going to increase exponentially. So that the threat of Sifrei Chasid or the danger of Sifrei Chasid are just as built in and just as endemic to keeping the situation the way it is now as perhaps the situation in which conversions, which some people don't recognize, would be carried out. And there's something else which I'd like to add, and that is that. And I think it's been one of the biggest tragedies that we've had in the halachic world. For 2,000 years, with prominent exceptions, there was a fundamental collegiality between Batei Din. And if a psak bezdin, doesn't matter on what, was carried out or was issued based on cogent and legitimate halachic reasons, then other Batei Din throughout the world respected it, even though they might not have ruled similarly. That has broken down. That's exactly what Rabbi Arentrau and the European rabbis have done. And the truth of the matter is, it's not just in Europe that the Rabbanut's own conversions have run up against problems. There are members of the Bezdin of America, of the RCA, that have expressed various hesitations. But in such situations like that, it's very simple. All you need to do, if you have a person who say, I don't accept their conversion, and the person is acceptable, so do another immersion in a mikveh. What happened? But at least the bottom line will have been maintained, because anything that's carried out according to Shulchan Aruch, at least ex post facto, and maybe I'm a professor, so maybe I'm just naive, but has to have validity, at least ex post facto.
Thank you. Anyone else raising their hands? Shelley, go for it.
Okay, I just want to ask, and I'm echoing something that I heard Rabbi Ido Pachter say. We know how the local rabbis today are appointed, and who has the power that puts them in, and who's to say that when they get when they get the power to do conversions, that it'll be easier than when the chief rabbinate does it?
Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you, Shelley. I'll make two observations. One, again, I don't want to put it as the chief rabbinate against the local rabbis. It's the chief rabbis, handpick rabbis, or the chief rabbis, other handpick rabbis who are doing the conversions, right? Whereas if the municipal rabbis get to do, or are enabled to, or empowered to do conversions as well, it'll just be another appointment of the chief rabbinate. And many of them, I would even say most of them, will not get involved in this at all. One of the things that the bill, again, the parts that I've been involved in the bill, is to enable municipal rabbis to, just like today, they're allowed to open up marriage files for people who don't live in their municipalities. The idea would be they would be able to open up a conversion process to people who also don't live in their municipalities. So essentially, what we need is just a number of them. I don't know if the number is 5 or 10 or 20, but we just need a number of them to be able to come along and start opening up benches, if you will. There's not a good way to say herkevim in English, but courts, so to speak, where, and again, one of the things that's being debated now, will be debated a lot in the committee, is the extent to which the rabbis have to sit on the bench themselves. Obviously, if we have 10 rabbinical municipal rabbis who are able to perform conversions, but they all have to sit on the bench itself. That's not going to be very effective in terms of increasing the numbers. But if we have municipal rabbis who are able to appoint rabbis to perform conversions, and they don't have to sit on the benches themselves, but simply provide oversight, that would be a much better model. Let me give you an example. The way marriage works in this country is exactly that way. The chief rabbi divests himself of the power to perform marriages, divests himself by appointing marriage registrars. The marriage registrars themselves don't perform the weddings. They simply provide the oversight. And the weddings are performed by the rabbis whom you see when you go to a chuppah. The idea would be for conversion to be the same way. It has to be done under certain rules and regulations. It obviously has to be done according to halachic standards. But the people who actually are performing the ritual act are not necessarily the people who the law empowers to do it, because they've divested themselves of the authority. So in response, again, just in direct response to the question, we don't need 100 municipal rabbis to be able to do this. We just need a few who will be able to, assuming they'll be able to divest themselves of the power and simply provide oversight.
Rabbi Wolf, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add that I had actually suggested, coming back to the, I don't know if it'll make a difference or not, but I had suggested to Minister Kahana and to Minister Kahana's office that there's one way of sort of squaring the circle in terms of dealing with the Or Sameach, and that is that, and also to upgrade the discussion, is that in addition to having the city rabbis delegate authority to courts that they would establish, that there would be some sort of formal certification process for those individual rabbis who would serve on the courts and be empowered as Dayanei Giur. It's just sort of like a frill, but I think it might be able to take some of the edge off of the discussion and raise the status of the Herkivim that would be established.
Right. Without getting, I don't want to get cynical, but I will just give an example of how things can get cynical without being angry about it. But 3 years ago, the chief rabbinate actually provides an exam in Giur. There is such an exam that you can take to study. And 3 years ago, in anticipation of the way things were going and the fact that Giur Kalacha was already, well on its way at that point, the chief rabbis shut down that exam. They wouldn't allow people to take the exam because we were promoting the fact that people who were performing conversions in Giur Kalacha were taking the exam of the chief rabbinate and were certified to perform conversions. So they simply stopped enabling people to take the exam unless you were studying for, a dayanut. So that's kind of like a cynical act that, again, I think has to be removed from the table. And instead we need to kind of work on this together, which is what I'd like to see happen.
Most definitely. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand and we'll be able to open you up or send it on the chat. Okay. Well, in that case, I really want to thank you for helping us better understand the unique challenges to this issue. I see Rav Eitan has another question, but what I'll do is I'll close and say thank you, and then we can have more. If there's more time, we'll have more questions. We see that this is a unique challenge, really, for our time and our place, and we pray that we can work toward resolution. Okay, Rav Eitan.
Let's see.
Rav Eitan, you have a question? Okay. In that case, I really want to thank you. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you again to our partners. And
Wait, can you hear me now?
Oh,
can you hear me now?
Hi, Rav Eitan.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, just one more question. Do you right now it seems like both sides are playing sort of high stakes game, and everyone's very strong and harsh rhetoric. I'm curious, Rabbi Wolf and Rabbi Farber, do you see there being some sort of compromise, that everyone will come to? Can you see that being a possibility, and what might that look like, between where two sides are at right now?
You want to go first?
Thank you.
No, it's obvious what I'm going to say, right? You remember the Rambam in Hilchot Malachim, right? We can't predict what the Messianic era will look like.
I would like to think that the better, to quote Lincoln, the better angels of our nature will at least b'diavad accept the the positions that we're advocating. I think that we should. One of the things that hopefully, once it's a done deal, the Karabi Amenu, that the discussion will no longer be politicized not just in terms of the rabbinate, but unfortunately, it's been caught up in the never-ending electoral rhetoric between the yes Bibi no Bibi people, and that unfortunately this is an issue that really should transcend that, and that's actually also poisoned the water. So once the dust starts to settle, I would hope that we would trust the better angels of our nature.
Yes, and I can't help thinking about these numbers, which Rabbi Farber mentioned, that they were 200,000 and now they're 450,000. What's it going to look like if we don't work toward a resolution in the next 5 to 10 years?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everyone should have a good night and be well. And we look forward to doing more of these, hopefully in person as well. Good night.